Hello, Jack here, and in this episode I'm going to be talking about natural transitioning and FTM alternative. This video is a really long time coming. I'd originally planned on making pretty much a full-on remake of a video that I had put on my old channel entitled Why I Discourage Natural Transitioning for Trans Men, where I talked about, obviously, why I discourage natural transitioning for trans men, and that includes stuff like using over-the-counter herbs and supplements, and as well as diet and exercise as a substitute for testosterone replacement therapy. I considered that an important subject because a lot of my followers on that channel were people who didn't want to be on hormones in the long term, and I was also doing an herbal series for trans men at that time, so I just sort of expected that there would be an overlapping audience there, and because it was important there, I decided that it was also important here. While I was rewriting that video, I decided that I should actually read the second edition of the book just to be fair. I was familiar with natural transitioning and with Tristan Skye, but I'd read that the current edition, the second edition, was very different from the free version that I was familiar with, as well as the first edition of the book, and I didn't want to misrepresent anything, so I bought the book, and I read the book, and this wound up pulling me down a rabbit hole that I've been going down for like a month and a half now. And I've written and rewritten this episode at least a dozen times, and filmed it at least 3 times, because it's just been a really weird subject to research, and it's a very weird subject to talk about now that I have a fuller awareness of the issue. I actually had like 5 or 6 episodes of content on this weird transgender cultural icon that is natural transitioning, and I may very well make more episodes about this subject in the future as I learn more, because it's been a ride. This episode is going to be very long, and because of this I'm going to throw up some timestamps here so that you can easily navigate to different parts of the video if there's only some aspects of this that you're interested in. I do recommend the supplements section, because that's what most people are going to be interested in, but I think the whole thing is going to be, again, a ride. But yeah, I sort of upgraded my video title. I no longer merely discourage natural transitioning for trans men. I'm going to just flat out tell you, natural transitioning doesn't work. It isn't safe. It doesn't do what it's advertised to do. And the whole story that convinced loads of people into thinking that it might work is really misleading. I'm also including a lot of citations, including the studies that I talk about. All of that will be both in the description and in the rolling end credits, so you can confirm or deny anything that I say here. There's also going to be a trigger warning for weight loss related content, and other related things. That's going to be way at the end of the video though, so if you're interested in this overall subject but not in that content, you'll have an opportunity to turn the video off without missing a whole lot else. Anyway, let's begin.
That one guy who grew facial hair using supplements.
Natural transitioning, also known as NT, is a program developed by a trans man named Tristan Skye and his wife, starting in late 2008. Skye was a well-known trans activist who also ran a social media network called Trans Queer Nation, or TQN, and it was on TQN that he posted his program for free for a while, before eventually self-publishing it as a book called Natural Transitioning and FTM Alternative. The premise of NT is that a trans man, or really any other AFAB trans person who desires a more masculine appearance, might be able to increase their body's natural testosterone production enough to experience limited testosterone-like effects or virilization. This includes things like increased facial hair, increased body hair, a deeper voice, and changes to body composition such as higher muscle and a more masculine distribution of body fat. Tristan himself was really the advertisement for this program. Most notably, he had facial hair before he eventually went on hormones, and he attributed that facial hair to his natural transitioning program. This has become somewhat of a persistent cultural memory in the trans male community. When this subject comes up, you can still find people talking about that one guy who was able to grow facial hair using over-the-counter supplements. And based on their descriptions, my personal impression is that that 9 times out of 10 these people are talking about Tristan Skye himself. Tristan had a YouTube channel documenting this, which is now mostly gone. Some of it is just unlisted, and you can access it if you still have the links, but the rest of it is all deleted. It's not up anymore. The reason this stuff isn't up anymore is because Tristan decided to go stealth while he was writing and publishing the 2nd edition of his book. And because he's stealth, I'm not going to do things like post photos or video clips of him. The only personally identifying information that I'm choosing to put in this video is stuff that is either in his book or still exists on Trans Queer Nation or somewhere like that. This brings up an important point. This guy hasn't taken a trans-related platform in like 6 years. The point of this video isn't to antagonize him or cancel him or deplatform him. You can't deplatform somebody who isn't on the stage. It's just to explain why over-the-counter supplements don't work in the way this book says that they do. And since he's almost single-handedly responsible for the myth that it does work or can work in some people, it's just unavoidable that I need to talk about Tristan Skye and how he factors into this whole equation. So if you read Tristan's bio in this book, it says the following.
The first changes I noticed were a decrease of fat and increased muscle tone. I started to grow sideburns and acquire chin hair. My facial shape became more masculine, and I also noticed my hips were narrowing. My voice deepened with the help of voice exercises.
This, especially if you're familiar with his appearance, gives the impression that Tristan did the things that this book describes, and it resulted in facial hair growth and voice deepening. And that's incorrect for multiple reasons. First of all, he had facial hair before he decided to transition at all. And second, the original natural transitioning program that he promoted for years looked nothing like the generic herbs and spices that you'll find in this particular book. The facial hair thing is a really heavy accusation, so I want to be clear here that I did not just make an assumption based on a vague sense that he probably had facial hair already. He admitted to this in a blog post where he talks pretty candidly about the fact that when he was still living as a girl, he struggled with facial hair removal because he was naturally hairy, and people, I guess, bullied him for that. This post is called Want More Hair? Awaken Dormant Hair Follicles, and in it he describes spending hundreds of dollars trying to get rid of his facial hair and failing to do so. To quote that post,
Around 10 years ago or so, having facial hair was something more of an embarrassment than something I embraced. I was pre-transitioning, living as female, and all the bleaching and waxing became more and more a pain in the butt. I was embarrassed because my natural state of being hairy was looked down upon by my female cohorts. Women are supposed to be hairless. Society would like to make you think, and I certainly bore my Italian ethnicity with not much pride. In attempts to help boost my self-esteem, my mother offered to pay for treatments of electrolysis and then, eventually, laser light hair removal. Even with over $1,000 down the drain, I still had facial hair.
And there's nothing like weird or wrong about this, but the fact that he doesn't mention it in his book is a huge oversight, and it's really misleading. Obviously, it's not some deep, dark secret if he's blogging about it, so I'm running under the assumption that he believes that it's no big deal and that he did grow more facial hair by using natural transitioning or something like that, but he has no way of knowing that natural transitioning is what gave him that facial hair. AFAB folks who naturally grow facial hair often find that they grow more as time goes by, and they're also particularly susceptible to the virilizing side effects of some supplements. So if he was naturally hairy, and he says he was right here, his results just aren't applicable to trans men who aren't naturally hairy. He also mentions in this post that his attempts to remove his facial hair failed, and he said he did research indicating that these treatments often do fail, and even when they do succeed, the hair might still grow back down the road. So it's just really silly to me that he would assume that his facial hair growth must have been caused by natural transitioning when all of these other factors took place, and when those are taken into consideration. I also want to note that I see almost nobody ever bring this up. One of the more popular videos out there attempting to debunk natural transitioning that I'm not going to cite because somebody got himself canceled, it's critical of natural transitioning, but it neglects to mention that Tristan Skye had facial hair before coming out. And since this is a really big deal, I'm just under the impression that he doesn't know about it. It never became common knowledge that that one guy who got facial hair using supplements had facial hair before using supplements. The second important thing to mention is that if Tristan did get all of these virilizing side effects from a natural transitioning program, it wasn't the one in this book. The original program was loaded with bodybuilding supplements and was especially heavy on fat burners and diet pills. A number of these supplements were found to be contaminated or adulterated with things like anabolic steroids and estrogen blockers. A large percentage of folks I found who were really, really adamant that they were able to do things like grow facial hair or deepen their voice on natural transitioning mentioned specifically that a lot of this occurred while they were taking a supplement called Novadex XT, which was found to contain both an illegal anabolic steroid and an illegal estrogen blocker. These supplements are not in the current edition of this book. Tristan says that he doesn't recommend them anymore because they're dangerous and they have weird ingredients. And he's right, and I'll talk about that in a bit, but they also are the most likely of the supplements in any of these natural transitioning programs to cause that virilization, and they're absent in this book. One thing I debated whether or not I'd mention, so I'll just touch on it, is this. Tristan Skye did eventually go on hormones. The fact that he went on HRT after trying natural transitioning is not inherently sinister in any way. People's transition needs change over time, and that's fine. But I remember when he said that he'd gone on hormones, and it was after he'd already been taking them long enough for people to suspect that he was on testosterone based on what was going on in his videos. I have no idea how long he was on hormones before he told people, because that announcement doesn't seem to be up anymore. But it's just really important to note that there was a period of time there where people thought that he wasn't on testosterone, and he was, and it was long enough for people to have arguments over whether or not he looked like he was on testosterone. The next thing I want to mention here is that you can watch people on YouTube and Tumblr and TQN attempt natural transitioning, and the people who are actually able to stick with it tend to change in ways that you would expect for somebody who went on a diet and exercised a lot. I've seen 2 pictures of people who allegedly grew facial hair on natural transitioning, and they both needed to use either mascara or hair dye for it to show up. And these were people who were on those early versions of NT that had the anabolic steroids, so consider 3 years of this monumentally time and effort intensive program using the supplements within it that are the most likely to cause these side effects, and you might have enough facial hair to look like you have sideburns if you emphasize it with dye or makeup. And I'm not picking on these people for their appearance. There's nothing wrong with darkening your facial hair or using makeup to emphasize features you like. It's just really important to recognize that the best example of somebody who allegedly was able to grow facial hair on a program like this was somebody who admitted he was able to grow facial hair before natural transitioning. And others who have claimed to get that same effect largely had to do more than just take these supplements. They had to either darken their facial hair or use minoxidil, which is another factor here. A lot of people who are on natural transitioning also use minoxidil, and that can work for helping to grow facial hair in some people who aren't on testosterone. And it'll probably need to be dyed to be visible, but if this is being used, then there's no way to verify whether or not increased testosterone from these supplements and lifestyle changes made any difference at all, because minoxidil doesn't care if you have elevated testosterone. It doesn't. It has its own mechanism for growing it. Looking at these timelines is something that I really encourage if you're considering natural transitioning. If you go to Tumblr, Instagram, or YouTube or something and look up natural transitioning, you can find a lot of people who are trying it. I have found very few people who have gotten any changes at all outside of muscle gain and fat loss, which you don't need these excessive supplements to achieve, and often they don't even get that. I've waded through many examples of people trying natural transitioning, and many of them basically nothing happened. I saw one today where somebody had tried natural transitioning for 2 years. He had talked about how he doesn't even look like the same person anymore. But if you look at his before and after picture, the only difference is that he is frowning in one of them. And that was like the this one I saw like right after I saw a different one where the only difference was that he got skinny. And I'll talk about that in the weight loss portion of this video, because it is my general custom to put potentially triggering content at the end, and it was definitely something that I think qualifies. So I'll move beyond that now. Finally, once in a while I see people who defend natural transitioning by saying that the people who go on it aren't looking for testosterone-like effects. They're looking for a very slow or very subtle transition, and they want to be able to control the changes that they go through. First of all, controlling changes doesn't really make sense. It's not something that you can do on either natural transitioning or testosterone. I guess you could argue that you can stop natural transitioning if you start experiencing side effects you don't like, but you can do that with testosterone too. There are plenty of people who go on testosterone and then either lower their dose or stop it altogether once they hit changes that they don't like. But more importantly, I've watched a lot of people try natural transitioning, and the vast majority of them seem to really hope to get testosterone-like effects. And I'm dubious that they're hoping for it to be slower or more subtle. I think that they are looking and hoping for just a flat-out replacement of hormone replacement therapy. Some of these people posted updates like a week or two into natural transitioning, and they seemed to imagine that they were going through things that they probably wouldn't have even experienced on hormone replacement therapy yet. And most importantly, it doesn't work like that either. The select few people who were able to maintain natural transitioning for extended periods of time generally don't have those effects. You can see it with your own eyes, and you can hear it with your own ears. As an aside, the fact that you can basically just watch this not work, that's addressed in this book. Tristan basically says it's their fault because this program totally will work if you just do it right.
Through many trials and error, I found that natural transitioning is possible. If you follow the NT guidelines, you will get results. All you need is dedication, willpower, and knowledge. I formulated a plan that has worked for hundreds of trans men worldwide.
He also makes it very clear in this book that you need to do all 3 steps of the program: supplements, diet, and exercise, and if you skip any, it won't work as well.
It's a 3-step process. If you choose to only do 1 or 2 of the 3 steps, your results will most likely be limited and slower.
This is the way Tristan and other natural transitioning defenders explain away the many people who don't see adequate success from this program. Basically, it's their fault. They didn't do all of the steps. They didn't eat right. They didn't exercise enough. They didn't do it long enough. It's not the program. It's them. Now, I'm going to break character a little bit here. In most of this video, I am very intentionally taking the position that Tristan Skye is just misinformed, that he doesn't really understand the studies that he's reading, that he really believes that this program works, that he believes that it worked for him, etc. But regardless of his feelings about how natural transitioning works, the fact that he just sort of blames people for not getting it right is super toxic. This book isn't even the program that he claimed to transition on. He claimed to transition on this older program that was loaded with anabolic steroids and bodybuilding garbage. He has no evidence at all that these generic herbs and spices do what he says that they do. He basically just falls back on, if it doesn't work, it's your fault, even if he doesn't word it that way. And because of that, I want to be very, very clear here. Because I know that a lot of you have tried natural transitioning. A lot of people tried it and won't admit it because they're embarrassed. A lot of people tried it and then say things on the internet like, oh, but I didn't do it long enough, or but I didn't do the whole program, and they basically blame themselves. And here is the fact. It is not your fault that it didn't work. It doesn't work. It doesn't work for practically anybody. I'm personally extremely doubtful that it even worked for Tristan. It's just not an effective program, and you just keep that in mind. As we go through the rest of this, that is one thing that I really want to get across. People who failed on this program, they're not the failures in this situation. Anyway, going back in character here. To conclude this section, this program was popular specifically because of one single person's results, but whether or not those results actually came from natural transitioning is suspect. It's dubious. The program he initially claimed to transition on was loaded with supplements that contained stuff like anabolic steroids, so even if he did get virilizing effects from it, it wasn't from increasing his body's natural testosterone production or whatever he claims. Most people who try NT do not get virilizing effects from it, even though they clearly want them and often imagine that they're happening. This doesn't work.
Is natural transitioning safer than testosterone? Spoiler: no.
One of the reasons that people might opt for a natural transitioning method is because they're worried about the health effects of testosterone. In his book, Tristan Skye makes the following statement.
Natural transitioning, as in any type of hormone replacement method, is not 100% healthy, yet it is healthier because it is a slower process that leaves the person in more control and able to monitor their changes and transformation. It is not synthetic hormones, but simply an increase in your natural testosterone production.
This is an extremely bold claim, and it's also entirely wrong. Long-term studies of testosterone replacement therapy in trans men show that it's actually pretty safe when administered correctly. Natural transitioning, on the other hand, is at best ineffective and at worst outright dangerous, and earlier versions of this included supplements that literally killed people. First, I want to validate that I understand why people are afraid of testosterone. When I was in college, I watched a now very dated documentary series called Transgeneration, and in it, there's a subject named Lucas who is debating whether or not he wants to go on hormone replacement therapy. He really needs testosterone, that's very clear, but he's also convinced that if he takes it, he's going to automatically shave 10 years off of his life. I believed that for years. I heard it on a documentary, therefore it must be true. And you can't lie on a documentary, right? The stigma surrounding trans men's healthcare has not gone away since that point. So people like talking about testosterone as if it's some poison that will not only make you more aggressive, it will also give you a heart attack in the process. Real evidence, though, suggests otherwise. One particularly large and long study on trans men who had been on medically supervised testosterone replacement therapy for over 10 years showed no increase in mortality at all. From the abstract of this 2011 study in the European Journal of Endocrinology,
in FTM transsexuals, total mortality and cause-specific mortality were not significantly different from those of the general population. In the FTM transsexuals, use of testosterone in doses used for hypogonadal men seemed safe.
Now, it's not that there's no side effects, but these are generally manageable. And if you're worried about that, you also have the option to go on a lower dose of testosterone or even stop it after a while if you want. Testosterone is an FDA-approved pharmaceutical drug, meaning it's had to go through many tests and trials in order to be sold that way. Gender transition is an off-label use, but it's one that's been going on for a long enough time that it has a lot of evidence showing that it's safe and effective. Compare this to natural transitioning supplements. Dietary supplements aren't unregulated like a lot of people think they are, but they're regulated as a special subtype of food and not as drugs, so there's no obligation to prove that they're safe or effective. It is illegal to sell supplements that aren't what they say they are, or that are like outwardly dangerous, but many of them are nonetheless adulterated with harmful substances or don't have any of the ingredient that they advertise in them. Notably, the first two natural transitioning programs relied a lot on fat burners and diet pills, and these are some of the most commonly adulterated supplements out there. I'm going to include a link to a Vox article that has a large searchable list of supplements that were found to be adulterated, and with what, so you can search for these yourself if you feel like it. I already mentioned Novadex XT, which Tristan mentioned by name when responding to somebody who pointed out that Tribulus terrestris can increase estrogen. He implied that Novadex XT could help counteract the estrogenic effects, which is technically kind of true, I guess, but only because it contained illegal anabolic steroids and estrogen blockers in it. Meltdown, which was in the original program, contained an amphetamine-like drug. My favorite, though, is Oxyelite Pro. Now, this was mentioned in the TQN forums as being in the first edition of the book, and it was just downright hazardous. It was found to contain fluoxetine, which is also known as Prozac. This interacts with a lot of medications and can cause life-threatening interactions with some of them. Oxyelite Pro is also extremely bad for the liver. This supplement has killed literally several people. It's resulted in multiple liver transplants, and it's injured many others. Like at least 50 people got serious liver damage from this supplement. So in order to avoid a medication that people only imagine is unsafe because of stereotypes, natural transition users from this area of the program were risking literal death with this sort of bullshit. Even if you don't wind up with adulterated supplements, that doesn't mean they're somehow safer than going on testosterone. Even the most natural herbal supplements have plenty of side effects. I personally had to stop taking licorice and St. John's wort, both of which I really like, because they raise my blood pressure and interact with my medications. Speaking of interactions, trying to figure out interactions is significantly more of a pain in the ass with a handful of supplements than it is with just one drug. If I run my own medications through an interaction checker, I get one interaction when I'm on testosterone, but 4 if I replace the testosterone with all of the supplements in this book. And that's just the ones that I can actually find in the interaction checker, which is another thing. Because supplements don't require the same amount of testing as real FDA-approved drugs, it's not always as clear what conditions and medications these products interact with. A lot of supplements are particularly bad for the liver, and this is very important because one of the main groups that this book mentions as benefiting from natural transition are people with liver ailments who aren't able to go on hormone replacement therapy. This is a real contraindication to testosterone replacement therapy, but it's also a contraindication for many of these supplements. DHA might be really bad for the liver in large doses, and although Tristan Skye rarely provides doses, he does give a relatively high dose for DHEA. DHEA, by the way, is straight up a hormone pill. It's not like some natural off the tree get your DHEA from like a root in the ground or something. It's weird that it's even available over the counter here. It's available in the United States over the counter. In places like Canada, Australia, and the UK, it's only available with a prescription. Tristan claims in his book that this program has been approved by doctors. And then he mentions that these are naturopathic doctors specializing in homeopathic remedies. And the doctor who provides the testimonial in the back of the book lists homeopathy as one of her specialties if you look her up. And that's a huge red flag. A lot of people think that homeopathy is just another term for natural medicine, but it isn't. It's a specific subfield of natural medicine specializing in sugar pills that touched water that might have come within a few feet of a toxic substance once. The doctor is also an ND or a naturopathic doctor, which isn't a real doctor in the way an MD or a DO are. But anyway,
Those supplements don't work like that.
this part of the episode is the most fun and also the most mind-bogglingly frustrating to research, and because of that, I could really go on about it forever. And it's also the longest part, but it's also the most important in my opinion, because the information that I'm about to give you isn't really limited to Tristan Skye's version of natural transitioning. It's something that applies to like Pinterest posts or Facebook posts that trans men might put up talking about increasing testosterone with like food or herbs or etc. One of the biggest premises in this book, as well as those posts, is that over-the-counter supplements, herbs, vitamins, stuff like that, as well as certain foods, have the ability to not only increase your testosterone levels, but increase them enough to cause virilizing side effects in trans men who aren't on testosterone replacement therapy. These supplements include things like DHEA, Tribulus terrestris, zinc, D-aspartic acid, garlic, and many others, combined with a couple of herbs meant to counteract the effects of taking so many supplements, like milk thistle and dandelion. When you look for information about this subject, a lot of videos and articles will say that it doesn't work, and they usually do get the basic premise of why they don't work correct. The video that I referenced earlier mentions that trans men just don't have the parts responsible for the alleged testosterone boost that these supplements are supposed to give you. And that's true, but it's not the only reason that these supplements don't work. And even in cases where that is the problem, it can be really easy to misread a study if you read it at all. And I'll be 100% dead honest here. I do not think that Tristan Skye has really read any of the studies that he's referencing in this book, and I think it'll become clear as to why when I get into this section. This book is dreadfully undercited. Tristan writes a lot of really convincing sounding jargon that's referencing studies, but he doesn't include any actual citations for studies, and that's a huge problem. If you're writing a literal paper book that you know people are going to be using to make major medical decisions, you 100% need to be citing things, and he just doesn't do that. At best, he says what journal he read something in or what team did the study, but he doesn't even include that in most of these entries. and I'll get more into that later. If you read the original Natural Transitioning program, you find that a lot of this was actually masterminded by Tristan's wife, Cicely, and it was based on natural female bodybuilding, which is why that original program was so aggressively loaded with branded bodybuilding supplements. There's a piece in Skeptic on the Surly Amy column that talks specifically about this bodybuilding aspect. In it, they talk to a gym owner who has experience in natural bodybuilding and personal training, who indicated that cis women who do natural bodybuilding generally don't see effects like what this program advertises as far as voice changes and facial hair growth. These are things that only really tend to happen with female bodybuilders who go on steroids. So immediately the premise here doesn't really make sense unless you are indiscriminately just believing stereotypes about female bodybuilders. If you're interested in learning more about that bodybuilding aspect of those original two programs, I do suggest that you read that article, and I'll link to it in the description. The current version of the book doesn't include them. It's mostly just pretty innocuous herbs and supplements. I'm not going to go through every single supplement and food in this book, and that's for two main reasons. First, if I go through all of them, then I'm sharing all of them, and I don't want to do that. But more importantly, it's really repetitive. Almost all of the herb supplements and foods in this book are subject to the exact same fallacies, and almost all the studies he seemed to be referencing are irrelevant to trans men for the exact same small set of reasons. First, a lot of these studies are done on cis men and male rodents, and the mechanism of action referenced in most of these studies is just not found in AFAB bodies, at least those of us who are not on testosterone, or even in those of us who are on testosterone a lot of the time. For instance, he talks about luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone in a couple of these entries. In the entry on zinc, he says,
A low zinc diet stops the pituitary gland from being able to release the luteinizing and follicle-stimulating hormones that stimulate testosterone production.
Look this up. There were a number of studies talking about this, but they were all done on cis men and male rodents. The reason that luteinizing and follicle-stimulating hormones do this in AMAB people and in male animals is because they initiate changes in the testicles. In AFAB folks, these hormones control the menstrual cycle and ovulation instead. In short, the mechanism of action is stored in the balls. This is also the case with D-aspartic acid, or DAA. He's real excited about DAA, saying,
This amino acid plays a critical role in sperm cell and sex hormone production. Research has shown that D-aspartic acid may enhance luteinizing hormone and testosterone by 46% and 45.5%, respectively, in only 13 days. An almost 50% increase in testosterone in less than 2 weeks is very impressive.
He spells luteinizing hormone differently here, by the way, which is a plagiarism red flag, but I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. He goes on about human growth hormone, but when I try finding the studies that he's talking about, the first thing I encountered for DAA was a wall of ads. The verbiage is also very similar to some of these ads, another plagiarism red flag, but one of those ads finally had a study attached to it, and that study concluded that the mechanism of action is in the testicles. My impression is that in at least some of these cases, he's relying on information about studies that he got from supplement ads, and these ads may very well be referencing real studies, but people selling these products have no real incentive to say this only works in cis men or this was only studied in cis men. And since Tristan is clearly prone to just getting overexcited about anything that potentially could increase testosterone, he just goes with it. In the section about vitamin D, he talks about a study in the European Journal of Endocrinology where he concludes vitamin D deficiency may be correlated with hypogonadism. The thing about this is that he seems to have gotten the conclusion of the study pretty accurate here, but still thinks that it has something to do with trans men. But cis male hypogonadism isn't the same thing as being a trans man, so this study just has nothing to do with anything. He just includes it for reasons. There are some cases where a supplement is unreliable. It could increase testosterone, but it also could increase something else. DHEA is a good example of this. It can increase testosterone, but it can also increase estrogen and a number of other hormones. It's also very weird that this is available over the counter in the United States. I mentioned this earlier, but in the UK, Canada, and Australia, among other countries, this is only available with a prescription because it's not a natural herbal remedy or vitamin supplement. It's just straight up a hormone pill. DHEA has also primarily been studied in menopausal cis women. This is the second big issue with a lot of these studies that on what increases and decreases testosterone and estrogen in AFAB people. When going through menopause, cis women's hormones change drastically. Their level of estrogen and testosterone both decrease, but the estrogen levels decrease more rapidly, which can cause virilizing effects even without using any supplements. So a supplement potentially causing facial hair growth and voice deepening and stuff like that in older cis women doesn't necessarily mean anything for younger trans men. It's better than relying on cis male studies and rodent studies, but only just. My favorite part of the DHEA section, though, is that significant portions of it appear to be blatantly plagiarized. Like, a couple whole paragraphs here seem to be copied and pasted. I'm not sure exactly where this originally came from, but I did find this exact wording on the Mayo Clinic page. And that's particularly funny to me because Tristan Skye has a history of coming after people who post information from his books, claiming that he trademarked natural transitioning, which I can't find any evidence he actually did, but regardless, it's really hypocritical. But just being hypocritical is not the only problem with the level of plagiarism he's committing here, and I'd argue it's not even the main problem. The main problem is that he's almost certainly copying and pasting so much because he's not really familiar with what these studies are saying and doesn't have the capability to put it in his own words. Now, not everybody can write, but I've read other stuff that Tristan Skye did write, and he's not, like, super incompetent at writing or anything, so the only conclusion that I can come up with is that he has no idea what these studies are actually saying and needs somebody else's verbiage to fill in that knowledge gap. Even in cases where they aren't plagiarized, the regionally inconsistent spelling is a red flag that he's copying concepts that he doesn't really understand. Why would somebody in the United States spell estradiol with an OE at the beginning? Is he aware that this is just a different spelling of a word we also use here, or does he think that this is a different thing? Luteinizing hormone I can kind of give him a pass on because those spellings both look fine to American eyes, but the UK spellings of estradiol and estrogen look really weird when you're not used to them, and he just seems to do this with the word estradiol and not estrogen, so I don't know, it's just like a weird red flag for me. Anyway, one of the supplements that I spent a lot of time on because it was such an interesting rabbit hole was Tongkat Ali, also known as Long Jack, which is where we get to the rodent studies. The reliance on male rodent studies is particularly annoying, and although he does occasionally mention that something was found in a rodent study, he does so infrequently that it's easy to assume that any study that doesn't mention rodents was done on humans, but most of them weren't. They were done on rodents, and usually male rodents. And in this Tongkat Ali section, there's a particularly egregious example where he says,
Tongkat Ali extract is clinically proven to increase your testosterone through the production of Leydig cells.
The thing is, I found 0 clinical trials on Tongkat Ali that said anything close to that. Instead, I found rodent studies, and those rodent studies focused on testicular Leydig cells. Either he found a study that I couldn't, if he'd cited it we'd know, or he doesn't understand what a clinical trial is, and I suspect that it's that second one. Whatever the case, though, the mechanism of action in those Leydig cell studies was unique to testicular Leydig cells, with no evidence that it works that way in AFAB bodies at all. The thing is, ovarian Leydig cells, they do exist, but they function differently than testicular ones. If you look at things that cause AFAB Leydig cells to produce elevated testosterone, you'll usually find that they'll do that in the case of like a serious medical problem, like a tumor growing in that area. So if yours do start pumping out enough T to grow literal facial hair, that's not good. That's potentially a sign of a serious medical problem that you need to get checked out. I couldn't find very many studies on cis women, so I did a quick peek on examine.com, which is a good source for finding the general trends in supplement studies. And according to it, there isn't much evidence to suggest Tongkat Ali increases testosterone significantly even in healthy cis males. So essentially what I think is going on here is he just really falls hard for supplement advertising and thinks that that constitutes research. Also, on that note, when I was rewriting this for like the 8th time, I encountered a conversation between Tristan and somebody on his social media network. That person had brought up that Tribulus terrestris might increase estrogen in AFAB bodies, and Tristan just totally blew this person off, claiming he's studied this more than anybody else, and therefore he knows what he's talking about. And then he recommended that this person take some Novadex XT in order to counteract those estrogenic effects. Yikes. So to be clear, people have told him exactly why his findings are not accurate, and he just deliberately ignores them. He ignores anything that contradicts what he believes, which is basically the anti-vaxxer school of research. Like, I don't know if he's an anti-vaxxer or not, but he researches in exactly the same way, is what I'll say there. When these supplements are studied in non-menopausal cis women, occasionally you do hit something that might increase testosterone levels. The problem, though, is that this doesn't necessarily mean that it increases T levels enough to cause those virilizing side effects that trans men are looking for. It might only increase testosterone up to your body's physiological limit, and in a typical trans man who isn't on testosterone, you're going to hit that limit way before you experience any serious virilizing effects from it. And again, most of the supplements in this book simply do not increase testosterone in trans men at all. Some of the studies I was able to find on stuff like Tribulus terrestris, that's not in this particular book, but it is in earlier versions of natural transitioning, and a lot of trans men do try it. Those studies were done on cis women who either are going through menopause or they have a low sex drive. It's been really hard to find good information on Tribulus terrestris as far as testosterone in AFAB bodies. There's decent evidence that it increases sex drive, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it increases testosterone. On that note, if your goal is to improve those psychological markers, things like energy, sex drive, or mood, then maybe this sort of herbal testosterone booster might be perfectly worth an experiment for you, and that's fine. But if herbs had the potential to cause significant facial hair growth and voice deepening in a large number of cis women at their recommended doses, they wouldn't be marketing those herbs and supplements to cis women, and they do. They market them to these women because that sort of side effect is rare, and it's usually only associated with certain populations of cis women. Now, a lot of trans guys do stuff like this, and I don't want to shame people for merely having a wrong epiphany about an herbal supplement. I've seen people do things like bring up a free trial of a natural male enhancement pill or something, asking if it might help them somehow, somewhere with something because it was marketed as like making your dick bigger or something. But these people aren't, for the most part, writing books about how trans men might be able to grow beards by taking Enzyte and selling those books for actual real money. And quite frankly, that's exactly what's happening here. So that's the deal with supplements. There is no evidence that they work. They do not work. Do not take them.
Dropping the ball on exercise.
There's one reliable way that you can get a more masculine red body shape without going on testosterone replacement therapy, and that's gaining muscle. You gain muscle by strength training, which this book dedicates a whopping 2 pages to, one of which is a third covered by a clip art that says gym over and over again in the shape of a dumbbell. The content of this basically just says lift weights and do HIIT, but it gives very little information of what to actually do. It's not necessarily bad information, but you would have gotten more and probably better information from reading like any single blog post on how to bodybuild on the internet. So a better use of your time and money, if this is something that interests you, is to get a gym membership or some weights or like a month and a half of a good bodybuilding app. Basically, the one thing that could have been very useful is not talked about practically at all. So here's where we get to the trigger warning. The following portion of the video talks about diet, body fat, intentional weight loss, eating disorders, and fad diets. It is critical of the way body fat is treated in this book and the natural transitioning community, but it's not entirely against weight loss altogether. So please take that into consideration when it comes to whether or not you choose to continue watching. This is the last section of the video with only a conclusion afterwards, so you won't miss anything else if you stop here.
Did you really, naturally transition, or did you just get skinny?
Earlier in this video, I talked about how a lot of people who are showing off their natural transitioning success stories are just showing off muscle gain and fat loss, and here's where I circle back to that. There was a particular picture that I saw that made me think a lot. Somebody had posted a before and after natural transitioning photo set over 1 year, which was captioned something like, "Natural transitioning is real." But there was no virilization in that photo. There wasn't even muscle growth, at least not that I could see in the headshot. Instead, it was clear that the only thing that happened was that this person had lost a lot of weight. This is something that goes way back in natural transitioning, and it's highly reflected in this book. To talk about a personal memory that I have, when TQN was still active, there was a pre-T trans man who had posted a picture of himself asking for advice on how to pass, as you do. People immediately told him to lose weight in his hips and chest. This was hugely problematic. Not only was he already a perfectly healthy weight, but you can't just lose fat in specific parts of your body. That's not a thing. People were telling this guy to do something that was not only super unhealthy, but impossible without anorexia level fat loss. And trans men have a huge rate of restrictive eating disorders specifically for that reason. The original 2 natural transitioning programs were heavy on fat burners and diet pills because losing body fat was not only a central goal, it was pretty much the central goal. In the second edition of the book, Tristan Skye thankfully dropped most of that shit, but he still has a toxic obsession with body fat. In multiple cases, he chides the reader to lose as much body fat as possible, insisting that the more body fat you have, the more estrogen your body will make, and the less testosterone you will have. Here is a nice direct quote from the book.
The more body fat equals more estrogen equals less testosterone. You've heard this before and you may hear it again by the time you finish reading this book. The higher your percentage of body fat, the more estrogen you will produce.
Here's the thing though, it's not true. High body fat is correlated with low testosterone in cis men, but I have found no evidence at all that this is the case in AFAB bodies. And in fact, weight gain, and especially abdominal obesity in AFAB folks, is correlated with unusually high testosterone. That doesn't necessarily mean that gaining abdominal fat increases testosterone levels, just that the more body fat does not equal more estrogen or less testosterone in trans men who aren't on HRT. He's just making the same assumption he's made in the rest of the book, which is that things that might increase testosterone or decrease estrogen in cis men must do the same thing in trans men, and it's just not true. It's a totally false assumption. When it comes to extreme weight loss, with folks who have typical anorexia and an extremely low level of body fat, both cis men and cis women have low testosterone levels because of it. Anorexia is not a good model for general average weight loss's effect on testosterone levels, but when you're cultivating a whole population of trans men who equate masculinity with losing as much body fat as humanly possible, you are grooming people into disordered eating, or at the very least, triggering people who are prone to them. Now, I said it in the trigger warning, and here it is. I'm not anti-weight loss. Losing weight isn't going to do what this book says that it will, but there are good reasons weight loss might be a part of your transition. I, for instance, need to hit a BMI cutoff if I ever want to get bottom surgery in the future, because phalloplasty is particularly prone to obesity-related complications. Will this book help you with that, though? If weight loss is an important part of your transition plan? The answer is no, it will not help. Here is Tristan Skye's basic advice. Go paleo, don't be fat. If you want to lose body fat in all seriousness, what you need is guidance on calories. You need to know how to calculate your daily calorie needs, how to determine a safe calorie deficit, and how to log your food intake accurately enough to meet those calorie goals. Going paleo might make that easier, but it won't automatically make you lose weight, and it won't automatically increase your testosterone. The reliance on paleo, by the way, is another big red flag. Speaking as somebody who has done paleo and who generally likes paleo, the paleo diet community tends to attract a lot of people who are just enamored with the concept of the manly testosterone-fueled caveman, so of course they would tell people that paleo increases testosterone. When trying to find actual studies on this, though, I found mixed results. But in the end, it's irrelevant. Although there are certainly some paleo foods that might increase testosterone levels in cis men, you run into the same problem that you have with the supplements and you do with the body fat studies. AFAB bodies just don't work the same as cis men's bodies. The mechanism of action is stored in the balls. It won't make AFAB bodies produce more than their physiological limit of testosterone, etc.
The conclusion.
So here's the conclusion. It would be great if we could really transition in the way that this book says that we can, or if any of these herbs and supplements could do this. But they just don't. And none of the research brought up by proponents of natural transitioning supports the conclusion that they do. It's possible to experience some positive effects from herbal remedies and supplements if you're trying to achieve only psychological benefits like increased sex drive and improved moods, but you're just not going to increase your testosterone levels enough to look like you're on testosterone. There was basically one person who appeared to achieve this, and his situation was a lot fishier than people seem to remember. When studies show that foods, supplements, and herbs may increase testosterone levels, they almost always are studies done only on cis men with little or even opposite effects in AFAB bodies. And studies done on AFAB bodies tend to be limited to menopausal cis women or only show small increases in testosterone. In addition, skinny and masculine are two entirely different things, and it's extremely dangerous to equate weight loss with transitioning. There is no need to qualify it with maybe, or in some people. Flat out, natural transitioning just doesn't work. It's built on a false premise, and regardless of whether or not Tristan, Skye, or any of its proponents believe it worked for them, it just doesn't work, and it never has. Anyway, that's it for this video, and like a month and a half of my life. Thank you for watching, and as always, happy trails.